1.8 billion people around the world live in fragile and conflict-affected areas, and many of them are in urgent need of humanitarian aid. In fact, 80% of humanitarian needs worldwide are driven by, you guessed it, conflict. Aid budgets are increasingly stretched, and so preventing and resolving conflicts is becoming more urgent than ever. The UN Secretary General has made what he calls sustaining peace central to his agenda. The classic formula is this: the United Nations, Western or regional powers bring all the parties of a conflict together to agree a peace deal and establish elections. And that approach successfully ended wars in the 1990s, but it isn't having as much success in today's conflicts. Take the peace talks in Syria and Yemen, or the peacekeeping missions in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, or South Sudan. All of them have struggled to end the conflicts. In other words, there's a whole lot of peace building going on for very little return. So is the traditional approach towards peace building working? Is it well suited for today's conflicts? And if we're witnessing the end of the big peace led by the UN, what will take its place? I'm Heba Aly in Geneva, Switzerland, and this is Rethinking Humanitarianism. Every year, the New Humanitarian publishes a list of 10 crises to watch. And this year, one of the items on our list was peace deals that are fraying. And there are a few possible reasons for this. The international community is distracted by COVID. It's hard to negotiate peace on Zoom. But more fundamentally, contemporary conflicts are so fragmented, they don't fit the mold of the massive UN peace conferences of the post-Cold War period. So in today's episode, we're asking, what kind of rethink is needed in the world of peace building? And we're going to talk about two types of conflict in particular that are on the one hand increasingly common and on the other difficult to resolve. The first is conflicts involving ideologically driven jihadists who don't necessarily want to come to the negotiating table. And the second is conflicts involving local criminals and bandits that are completely off the radar of international mediation in the first place, but just as devastating for communities on the ground. In these kinds of conflicts, can bottom-up approaches be a viable alternative to the more formal UN-led peace processes of the past? What can we learn from local peace-building efforts? What are the challenges? What does success look like? The New Humanitarian's senior Africa editor, Obi Anyadike, has been leading coverage of local peace-building efforts for us in a series that we're calling Beyond the Bang Bang, Reporting from the Front Lines of Peace. And that series looks at how sustainable peace can be built. Obi joins us from Johannesburg, South Africa. Hello.
Hi, it's good to be here.
So, Obi, our reporting has spanned a range of local peace efforts, from de-radicalizing Boko Haram fighters to secret peace talks between the government and jihadists in Burkina Faso. But I want to zoom in on a particular story that you reported late last year from your native Nigeria, and specifically a village in northern Nigeria called Doka, where 14 people had been killed by so-called bandits in an attack a few months before you visited. That led to reprisal attacks and more deaths. And you reported on how members of the communities involved in this violence ultimately brokered their own peace. Tell us a bit about that.
These are areas where there's been a lot of violence. Like in Kaduna South, at least 50,000 people have been killed because of a conflict over land and access to land and water. And the bandits have kind of fused their criminality onto those real existing conflicts. The really scary thing is no one knows really where this is coming from. It's like at night a village gets attacked and it's really hard to identify who's doing it. But it takes on a kind of an identity dimension because most of the people who are bandits, it's kind of a catch-all phrase, most of the bandits are Fulani pastoralists. Most of the guys they're attacking are local farmers. So basically what happens is that the farmers will look for revenge. They don't really know who the bandits were. They know they're Fulani, and so any Fulani in the area gets attacked. Whole communities get kind of demonized. So that's a kind of the background to it. So I was kind of interested in how communities are responding and if there's any kind of local initiatives to try and find a way to resolve this. Because it's cyclical. One community gets hurt, there's a revenge, and then there's another revenge, and so it goes on. But what was really interesting is after there'd been so much violence, people recognized that everybody was being hurt by this. And in a sense, this kind of came out of, it was a kind of a market-driven idea that we need to find a way to resolve this. All our livelihoods are being impacted. So basically what happened was, in this particular very tiny town, the farmers went to the Fulani community leader and said, come back. We want to reopen the market. We can give you security guarantees. Come back, bring your livestock, and let's go back to the way it was. It doesn't mean that we love you. There's still mutual distrust. But the idea was that you can bridge these really deep divides based on kind of mutual interests. The Fulani are predominantly Muslim and the farmers are predominantly Christian. They swept the mosque, invited the Fulani community back, and they celebrated Salah, a Muslim festival, in the mosque. The whole community was there as a kind of like goodwill, confidence-building gesture. So talking to the community guys, they were really proud of what they'd achieved. They'd been really scientific in how they approached it. So they tried to understand the genesis of the conflicts. They tried to understand what started it. And they tried to find out who the spoilers were. To me, it was indicative that where you have strong community organizations who are really working to solving their own local problems, this can really be successful. They didn't want to involve the national level for sure, but even at the state level, they were doing this independently of the state and their formal peace committee. And they were really proud that they'd done something that was really working. I don't know if it's going to hold up. I hope so. I mean, they have joint night patrols, and I think there's an understanding that though the bandits are predominantly Fulani, it doesn't mean that every Fulani man or woman is involved in this. And that's kind of important, that you can differentiate, and it's very difficult to do that.
How, in the reporting across the series and other stories you've done in other parts of Nigeria, how common is this kind of a model? Is it something you've seen elsewhere? Is it happening at scale?
I think the issue is that it's not happening at scale. And I think maybe that's a positive. It's also a negative, but that's a positive. I think these are hyper-local deals. And I think we're also seeing that in the Sahel as well, especially in Mali and to an extent in Burkina Faso. So the communities who are confronted with jihadist violence are making local deals with the jihadists. These are typically farming communities. Basically, the idea is, let's find a way that we can live together. We're all Muslim together anyway, so it's not a question of, the lifestyle changes dramatically. In a sense, you're finding common ground, and it's a recognition of traditional authorities as well and the role they can play. Similarly, in Zamfara State in Nigeria, their peace deals are being done by the community. To an extent, you could argue it's extortion. In some communities, they're paying a tax to the bandits to leave us alone. But, the bandits are also providing an element of justice systems. Everybody benefits from that agreement. So these are really hyper-local deals, and I think it gets complicated when you try and take it to the national level. They are what they are. And yes, you can say that there's obviously problems with it in northern Nigeria and in the Sahel as well. Women are not going to play a role in mediating peace there. These are conservative communities, so we're going to have problems around gender. We're going to have problems around women's rights, as possibly we're seeing in Afghanistan as well. So, let's not gloss over some of these issues, but people would argue that that can be a price to pay for peace.
When we compare these kinds of hyper-local deals that you've been describing with what we might consider the more traditional approach to peace in a violent context like the Sahel, as complicated as that is, when it is at the UN, Western, international, regional level, what does that usually look like?
We've seen the orthodox peace deal. So there's a peace agreement, the warlords are rewarded with government posts as part of the agreement. You have a peacekeeping force, do mobilization, there's some kind of transition to an election, and then the peacekeepers leave. The core grievances are not resolved. There's probably not going to be any transitional justice mechanism at all. And the communities who are preyed on by these armed men continue to see no justice in the post-conflict situation.
So if you were to look at the kind of pros and cons, if I can put it that way, of internationally led peace-building efforts and local-led peace-building efforts, where have you seen more success?
If, as the international community, you want to end the violence, then the model is usually these types of elite peace deals. If you want to build more inclusive, pro-change, progressive peace and you have the time, then obviously the bottom-up approach is the way to go. But all these words like bottom-up and inclusive peace, it all becomes verbiage in a sense. The difficulty is that we have to recognize the politics of this. So you have armed men, how do you buy them off in a sense? And you have powerless communities, how can they engage and be part of the peace process? So it really is a difficult dynamic. There's local authorities that have a role that can be played. In South Sudan, for example, where that was a kind of an exemplar of the elite peace pact, you do have a powerful church with a powerful moral authority. In the Sahel, you also have powerful religious leaders as well. The argument is that working through these bodies, you can deliver perhaps a more sustainable peace. But it takes time and it's complicated. What drives violence is not always just the fact that, it's about making money. Sometimes this is ideological, and that should be recognized.
Does one sometimes depend on the other? You talked about the international community's role being most effective when it's just about stopping the guns. But can you really do that local level peace building if you haven't stopped the guns? Or maybe put otherwise, is there a role for security forces even in local peace building contexts?
I think in some conflicts, there's going to be people that are unreconcilable. Let me take Zamfara, for example, in northwest Nigeria. So in Zamfara, there's a grievance that the pastoralist community has suffered under the current political dispensation. These guys have been marginalized, politics have skewed towards the farmers, and they have felt left out. And part of this sort of bandit problem, in inverted commas, was a real desire to basically make themselves known and their grievances known. There's been peace processes that have tried to stop the violence, demobilize the fighters, and that's to an extent sometimes has worked. But there's always the spoilers, there's always the guys who are just criminals. This is their bread and butter, so to speak. And perhaps those are the people who need to be brought to book. And that's a role for the security forces, the judicial system, and in a lot of parts of Nigeria and a lot of other countries in the world, the state is absent. There is no effective judicial system. The police are outgunned. There's 1-2 guys in a town with no petrol for their vehicle. What are they going to do? If you can bring on board the genuine people who have real problem with the state, and you can resolve that problem in an honest manner, that to me seems one step. And the next step is those who don't and want to continue with their violence, then they have to deal with the consequences.
So on the topic of people who have a genuine problem with the state or who are driven by ideological motives, I'm reminded of a great piece you reported a few years ago as one of the first journalists to actually speak to active Boko Haram fighters about the motivations and drivers of what had at the time become the deadliest militant or so-called terrorist group in the world. And groups like Boko Haram are, to my mind, a great example of the challenge posed to traditional approaches to peace building. To what extent can big agreements at the national or international level work in dealing with a group like that?
Boko Haram is now kind of disintegrated. Its replacement is Islamic State in West Africa province. The difficulty with dealing with these guys is, and I'm going to sound very controversial here, is they're a little bit revolutionary. Yes, it's a very conservative revolution, but their goal is ideological. They don't want anything to do with the Nigerian state. They see it as corrupt, venal, and enslaved by the West, and they want to build an alternative state. That's the political message they send, that we can provide things that the state has failed to do. We will be accountable, and we will provide systems of justice which are much, much faster and less corrupt than the state can provide. And I think a lot of governments fail to understand that there is a real political challenge that they need to respond to. Armed violence is not the way. It's an existentialist battle in a sense, because the state can't cede territory to Islamic State, and the Islamic State won't accept the state of Nigeria. So that's the real problem. I don't think there's a very simple peace process that gets over that kind of hurdle. But in the Sahel, we're seeing kind of free fire zones, peace areas at the very local level. The question then is, what happens at the national level? How do you make this work? And, for a lot of Western governments who've invested military in the Sahel, France for one, has been very dismissive of these local approaches. These global forces are worried that, it will spread jihadism. You always have that kind of old Cold War domino map that, this jihadism will spread across the continent and, into Europe, etc.
So France is a particular case given their historical ties to the region and continued military presence and so on. More broadly, to what extent has the international community been supportive of these kinds of hyper-local peace deals or helping to facilitate them or help them thrive?
One problem with these local deals is that when money gets involved, it becomes a problem. We always have these workshop cultures and the per diem culture, and when big money comes in, it kind of warps that process. And the peace becomes an arena of conflict in itself. In some cases, they're unaware of what's bubbling at the grassroots level. I think for them, it's easier to plug into the national rather than these local approaches. What was kind of interesting in Kaduna South, where I met this local community initiative, is that they were talking in terms of understanding the roots of the violence. They were talking in terms of understanding the drivers of the violence. So in a sense, they'd been exposed to some of the theories around peace building. So I think maybe it's at that level, perhaps. There's some kind of support that goes to these local guys, and then they do what they can. Peace is never easy, even when you've got billions of dollars, as we've seen in nearly every counterinsurgency conflict. It's even harder at the local level. But I think, again, it's that idea that at the local level, if there's shared interests between the conflicting parties that you can build on, maybe that is a kind of a path to some kind of imperfect peace, perhaps.
How has all the money that's been poured into counterterrorism, particularly in some of the regions we've been talking about, helped or hurt those local peace-building efforts? How does it change the dynamic?
Yeah, there's a lot of money flowing for sure, but it means a lot of groups get formed and you're not quite sure what they're doing, on whose playbook they're working off. And some of them seem a bit funny. Basically, it's just warmed over development programs that's given a new title. So it kind of crowds the market. And maybe it makes people kind of dismissive of, peace approaches. There's always, in northeast Nigeria for sure, there's always, this idea, there's a conspiracy. Why is the West interested in this conflict? It must be because they're making money out of it. Who are all these guys, local guys in 4x4s? Are they really here for peace, or is it in their interests to allow this conflict to continue? And that's not just Nigeria, that's around the world. We've seen that. So in a sense, big money can, warp the best of intentions.
I attended the Oslo Forum a few years back, and it's the most important convening of mediators around the world, convened by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And the executive director, David Harland, had written back then, the world is no longer making peace agreements. The United Nations in particular has almost lost an art that it once mastered. And the whole theme of the conference was around how, as we mentioned in the introduction, the big peace is over. And now it's really about local peace deals. That is the future. Would you agree?
I think part of the problem is they do the big peace deals and then they go away. To rebuild fractured societies, that money has gone along with the peacekeepers and everybody else. So I'm not sure if there was an art from the UN on these peace deals. I mean, certainly there was a lot of money. You had big peacekeeping forces and money in the transition and money into the democracy building. Did that democracy building really achieve anything? That simplification of those matrices and checks and indicators, and then, you say peace is achieved. Whereas on the ground, it might not look like that. There is a problem with how we conceive of the peace. And I don't think we should say it's either or. I think what we need is a rethink of how peace is done, what success looks like, what can reform societies to heal societies. And more of the same doesn't seem to be the answer.
Obi, thank you so much. It's been fascinating to hear about this. And your reporting, I think, has been really unique in delving into some of these communities in the way that you have. So I encourage everyone to take a look at that.
Thanks for having me.
So we heard from Obi that despite the importance of local peacebuilding initiatives, especially in complex, violent environments, they come with their own set of challenges. And to get an inside view on this and on just where peace building can be and how it can be most effective. I'm pleased to welcome a local peace builder to the podcast, Danjuma Dawop. Danjuma runs the peace building and early response program in Nigeria for Mercy Corps, and he previously worked in Iraq as the head of conflict management and social cohesion. He joins us from Abuja in Nigeria. Hello, Danjuma.
Hello, how are you?
Thanks so much for joining us. As I mentioned, you are working at a local level in peace building in Nigeria, especially on conflicts that are interethnic or interreligious. And I'd love to just understand when a conflict arises, where you even start as a local peace builder.
So in most cases, you discover that as a local peace builder, one of the things that you want to ensure is that this conflict had happened and it maybe caused a lot of loss of lives or properties. And so you want to prevent it from happening. And so you also want to understand what is the underlying cause of that conflict, what are the drivers, who are the parties, what is the real issue, what are the underlying, what are the surface issues, and how do you think that could be addressed. And the other thing is about ownership. We tend to look at communities as if they don't know how to resolve their dispute. That is why they have conflict. They do. Even before we come, even before the conflict, these communities have peace-building mechanisms, so to speak, where they resolve their disputes in their own way. So for local peace building, I think where we start was to actually examine what is being done. What is there on the ground? What kind of structures are responding to this conflict?
You mentioned that many communities already have mechanisms by which they resolve disputes. Could you give us an example of what that looks like in practice?
Almost all communities have a community structure. It's kind of a governance structure, so to speak. So you have the head of the community and he has people who support him. You have traditional rulers. One of the rules that this traditional ruler plays is also resolution of conflict. This is the structure that actually responds to conflict. And so the community leader actually listens. People come to them with issues around maybe whatever the cause of the dispute is. Using that old age mechanism, they resolve the dispute. Most times, it works. Peace-building actors like us, we know that you have this mechanism for conflict resolution. They will describe it to us, and we will discover within those approaches where probably there need to be improvement. Those are more or less our entry point for strengthening the local peace structures. Based on the context, you discover that in some communities, the traditional ruler is a traditional ruler because he belongs to a particular ethnic or religious group, which is more or less dominant. But then there are other ethnic groups there are other religious groups there who are not part of the conflict resolution mechanism. So we tend to include those as representatives as part of that to help, so that there's no impartiality. We don't reinvent the wheel. We only just actually build on and expand and strengthen. And for us, the sustainability component is important because when we leave, this continues.
Obi talked about the need for a rethink in the way in which peace building takes place. And you've just described a very different model to the more well-known international approach. And yet the model you've described also has its limitations because otherwise they wouldn't need you to come in if their local dispute resolution mechanisms were working. Where is the successful model?
For me, I think based on my experience, is a hybrid of models. What I mean here is that one, from bottom up, meaning that you have to build the structures from the ground up. It's a combination of having a community-led activities, resolving disputes at the community level in a transparent, inclusive, and beneficial way to the communities, and then ensuring that when this conflict becoming a little bit protracted, these communities had a way of reaching out for a higher level support. What we have and what we have been working currently, especially in both Iraq and in Nigeria, is to ensure that whatever at the community level that we do are connected to higher level initiatives, meaning that we feed into the top-level government peace-building initiatives. In some of the states that we work, we are very lucky to have those states having what we call peace-building agencies, that we can actually link up community-level activities to those peace-building agencies. Because they are higher level, they have convening power, they can talk to higher-level stakeholders, including international NGOs. One of the things that I see happening is the fact that more and more of international NGOs are willing to actually have what we call boots on the ground. And I think that is really helping in terms of helping communities not only to have that capacity to address their own conflict, but they also know that there are support systems outside their communities that help to support resolve some of these protracted conflicts.
You've talked a lot about the importance of that local ownership. I wonder the extent to which that is commonplace. How often do you see that model at play versus the model where an international peace-building apparatus is out of touch with the local community, and what happens in those cases?
International NGOs, the first thing they do is, we want to go and collect data for our baseline. And that is where the problem starts. Most of these communities will say, no, we don't want you to come in because that is not the issue we want to discuss. We want to discuss this issue. This is more important to us. Our conflict between farmers and herders is less important to us than the insecurity as a result of kidnapping and banditry. The other one is ownership. We need to more and more ensure that we put communities in the driver's seats of their peace-building efforts. We don't stop and listen. How do they want to do this? Most donors right now insist that for every international peace-building actor who is going to receive funding from them has to work with a local organization, local NGO. The reason being that these local NGOs might not have the exposure. They understand the community dynamics. They also have the acceptance and the trust of the communities. Most of these international NGOs, without understanding the context, rather than actually helping, do more harm than doing more good. And so you see more and more of international NGOs now working with either one or two or three or several local NGOs, depending on the location or the context, to ensure not only acceptability, but also because they see the need for local ownership.
That's really interesting because I would have expected the opposite, that in fact, local peace builders are not getting very much support and that they're struggling for the kind of attention and financing that bigger organizations may get. And certainly in the humanitarian sector, there's been a similar push for localizing aid, and that has struggled to make a lot of progress. So it's interesting to see that in the peace building world, in fact, you may be further ahead.
Because the donors insist that the international NGOs should work with the local NGOs to localize the peace building. And I think it's the understanding of the donor. I think it's the feedback that the donors get about some of the impact of the work that the international NGOs do, actually in exacerbating tensions in the communities in which they work. So then they decided, okay, I think the best way to do it is you must have a local NGO working with you.
How recent was that shift, would you say, from an approach in which the international NGO would come in and kind of say, this is what you have to do, to really listening to the communities?
I think as far back as 2015, there has been a little bit of a shift in the localization of peace-building activities, especially with regards to the local ownership. More and more of these local NGOs tend to hire people that are actually representative of the communities in which they are going to work.
Obi warned about not fetishizing or romanticizing local peace-building efforts either, and that there are challenges. You know, you talked a lot about the traditional leaders, but they often are male and, elite and come with another set of challenges. So what are the kind of warning signs that as a local peace builder you try to stay aware of?
One of the things that we also tend to try to avoid as we try to engage with these local communities is not to exacerbate tension or create divisions by trying to impose certain rules and norms that we think should. For instance, you mentioned that usually the people who are involved in the local peace mechanisms within the communities are usually leaders, male elites. And so it's also a little bit challenging for us when we engage with them to try as much as possible to get their buy-in into expanding the space to include other people, especially women. We tend to create what we call a women peace-building unit, meaning that depending on the context and then the culture and the dynamics and whatever limitations that doesn't allow some of these groups, especially women and youth, to be part of this process, was to create a separate unit for them to actually function within those communities. And so what we do in most of our programs is to ensure that we work with women. One other aspect of it is that there are women who are actually powerful within some of these communities. They are very influential, especially in communities where you have women participating in the economic activity. And so they have leadership role that they play, especially in the markets, where you have the heads of the market are usually women. And so some of these women, we identify them because of the role they play as leaders within those communities, and they also become part of the peace-building structures within those communities.
Danjuma, I have one last question for you. You have already given a number of examples of what works at the local level. If someone is either a local peace builder, an international organization, and looking to rethink the way they engage in peace building, especially in some of these more complex environments, what's a first step that they can take, a pragmatic thing that they can do to change and improve the approach to peace building?
I think real-time context analysis is really, really important. I think most of these international peace-building actors actually do a lot more of literature review of context without actually understanding that with peace building, the context always changes, the dynamics is always evolving. A community that you have maybe visited a month ago and then you are trying to understand what is going on, you have to go back and find out whether things have changed. And I think if that happens, it will go a long way in actually helping with the peace-building efforts within those communities. And the reason why I said so is that you discover that most times we tend to design a peace-building program around certain assumptions that we had probably like a year ago, 6 months ago, and so on and so forth. So using that assumption, we go in to implement our peace-building program. And things have changed within those times. So we just continue to insist that, we have already collected money from the donor. We don't want to go back to the donor and say, things have changed. We want to change our approach. So we tend to force community towards doing what we have written a year ago. So I think real-time context analysis and updating it and making sure that you understand what is going on and responding to every emerging conflict, context, and dynamics is really, really key.
Danjuma, thank you so much for sharing your insights and for taking the time to come on to the podcast.
No problem.
That's it for this episode. You can follow our reporting on local peace building on our website, thenewhumanitarian.org. And I want to say thank you to the Stanley Center for Peace and Security, which has supported our reporting on local peace efforts. If you've got thoughts on the topic, do get in touch. I'm curious, how can the international community support local peace building initiatives? Is local peace building necessarily more effective than international efforts? Have you seen successes or failures, and what can we learn from them? Write to us or send us a voice note at podcast@thenewhumanitarian.org. And thanks to those who gave feedback on our last episode about the politicization of aid in Ethiopia. Heba Aly from the humanitarian relief organization Project Hope described the episode on Twitter as a timely conversation about the challenges the aid sector is facing in Tigray. We also learn, she writes, about the history of humanitarian aid in Ethiopia and how past agreements with the government of Ethiopia are haunting the sector today. This week, we leave you with a clip from a TEDx talk called "To Solve Mass Violence, Look to the Locals" by Columbia University professor Séverine Autesser. This podcast is a production of The New Humanitarian. This episode was produced and edited by Marta Vanderwolf, and I'm your host, Heba Aly. Thank you for listening to Rethinking Humanitarianism.
International peace efforts have failed to help address local conflicts because of the presence of a dominant peace-building culture. So what I mean is that Western and African diplomats, United Nations peacekeepers, donors, the staff of most non-governmental organizations that work with the resolution of conflict, they all share a specific way of seeing the world. And I was one of these people, and I shared this culture. So I know all too well how powerful it is. Throughout the world and throughout conflict zones, this common culture shapes the intervener's understanding of the causes of violence as something that is primarily located in the national and international spheres. It shapes their understanding of the path toward peace as something, again, that requires top-down intervention to address national and international tensions. And it shapes their understanding of the roles of foreign actors as engaging in national and international peace processes. Even more importantly, this common culture enables international peace builders to ignore the micro-level tensions that often jeopardize the macro-level settlements.